Hi everyone, these are the notes in how bones are formed called ossification. So, we talked about bone cell types, but now we're talking about how originally the bones themselves are formed from the start. And then we'll have our bone cells come in to help us both in the formation process as well as the maintenance process of the bones that are made. Okay? So this is content we're going to cover. And before we really dive into how bones are formed, we need to do a quick recap of compact bone versus spongy bone. So you've already gone into compact bone in real depth when you went over the long bone structure, but just a reminder, compact bone is dense, strong, weight-bearing, stress-resistant bone with little spaces available for anything other than bone cells and blood vessels to help deliver nutrients to those bone cells. Our bone cells are organized, so the little black pockets here, those are spaces for bone cells. So each of those black pockets represents an area that you'll find a bone cell in, but they're all organized around a central canal for nerves and blood vessels. And they just create this really strong rings of densely packed bone and bone matrix, and then the cells that remain in those little pockets, and the pockets are lacunae, are going to just maintain and keep that matrix up to maintain and create as much density in the compact bone itself. So that's going to create a lot of strength. But it's also it's a really kind of hard candy coated shell on the outside of your bones. But the inside of your bones are not that way. And that's actually a good thing, because if the inside of your bones were fully solid like this, it would be really difficult to deliver things into your bones. And in addition to that, you wouldn't have any space to store anything inside your bones. And then your bones would be also super heavy if it was all compact bone. So we want spongy bone on the inside of our bone. Spongy bone is lightweight bone with lots of little holes inside of it. And the structure of this is called trabeculae. Trabeculae is basically this honeycomb lattice of tiny bone branches that have spaces inside of it that allow it to have a little bit of strength. Not as much as the compact bone, but it has enough strength. And the big advantage it has is because it's spongy, it also is more capable of absorbing impact and preventing bones from cracking all the way through, right? If it cracks, it only cracks a little bit in one section, but doesn't transfer that stress all the way through your bone to snap it in half, ideally. I mean, considering how much we jump up and down and how much force is on our bones, it's actually kind of amazing that our bones don't break all the time. And a lot of that is because of that strong structural mix of compact bone to help create kind of a hard, rigid layer on the outside, and spongy bone there to help keep it light but also absorb impact. Now, because it has those hollows, it also provides opportunity to store stuff inside our bones. So we store red marrow and yellow marrow in our bones, and red marrow in particular is found in spongy bone, and that red marrow is really critical to forming blood cells. And remember, blood cells, really important. It delivers oxygen, it fights off diseases, all that good stuff. And just a heads up, because all your bones on the inside have red marrow, because all the bones on the inside have spongy bone, if you want to donate bone marrow to someone, they actually typically take it from your hip, because your hip's bones are huge, but they're also flat. So it's a lot easier to get past. Flat bones don't have as thick of a layer of compact bone, so it's a lot easier to drill a tiny hole into it to grab bone marrow out of it. And in addition to that, the top of your hip at least isn't bearing as much weight as, for example, your leg. So it's a lot easier to grab marrow out of that. And when they take marrow out of that, they'll just use an IV to put it inside the patient. And the patient who's receiving that bone marrow, they take it in, and that red marrow, when it gets into our blood, it flows into blood vessels that eventually lead to where your bones are, because your bone, remember, has all those blood vessels running through it to help feed the osteocytes. And eventually it'll reach the spongy bone and populate the spongy bone's little hollows to make red marrow and then make blood cells. All right, so we went over that recap of the two kinds of bones. So now we are ready to go into ossification. So ossification is a term that specifically refers to the way skeleton is formed by replacing cartilage. So your skeleton is not skeleton bone at first. Your skeleton is first made of cartilage, and then as you grow bigger and you start moving through the world, that cartilage becomes bone. And anytime you want your bones to grow in size, you first, generally speaking, lay down cartilage, especially for like big growth, like puberty and stuff like that. You actually lay down cartilage first and then replace that cartilage with bone. There is way to form bone on top of previously made bone, but in terms of real growth, like growing inches, having a baby's head get a lot bigger, that's all thanks to cartilage ossification. Okay? So the big idea here is your mineral matrix in your bone actually prevents the bone from being able to stretch really easily. So bone growth is really going to be done through the expansion and stretching and growing in size of cartilage that's then replaced by bone. So for example, if you want your long bones, your bones in your arms and legs to grow, what you have is cartilage ends or cartilage plates at the end of your bones that are capable of getting longer so that you can get your bones to stretch out, get bigger and longer over time. So let's go over the main process to form those really big bones, your long bones. So this is called endochondral ossification. All right. So that chondro, that means cartilage. So and endo means inside. So it's internally taking that cartilage and turning it into bone. So in this case, we're replacing a template made of just hyaline cartilage with bone tissue. And this is the vast majority of your bones, how they're formed. And it actually, your bones start as pretty much our cartilage. And it takes until about the age of 25 for them to become fully bone. There's multiple stages of development, though. So we start with our cartilage model first. Then the cartilage, again, is made by and maintained by chondrocytes. Chondrocyte, site meaning cell, chondro meaning cartilage, so cartilage cell. They get really big as the cartilage model grows. And what happens is, because the cells get really big, they start to have a hard time staying alive and they end up popping. And the act of them swelling up and popping actually releases little chemical triggers that help encourage the calcification or hardening of the cartilage using calcium and phosphorus. Then what ends up happening is those holes that end up popping. So you have the cartilage pop a little bit, and this actually creates a little bit of a hole, and that's going to allow the opportunity for blood vessels to begin entering into the cartilage model. Anytime you have a blood vessel enter in, you have the ability to deliver bone cells, osteoblasts or osteoclasts. So in this case, it's going to actually, because you have your blood vessels start to dive into the very edges of your bone, you're going to be able to deliver osteogenic cells from your periosteum. The periosteum, if you recall, is the outer edges of the bone. It's going to help deliver osteogenic cells into the edges of the bone, which is then going to turn into osteoblasts, and then it's going to form bone. The process of forming bone initially starts in the middle of the cartilage model. So you're actually forming the diaphysis or the shaft first. This is called primary ossification. So we start by forming bone on the edges of our cartilage model in the diaphysis region, and we're going to form this bony collar using osteoblasts. Then, the image is covering up some of the words. Then what happens is, because the outer edges are bone, something weird happens, and it ends up meaning it has a harder time for wherever there's cartilage for nutrients to travel to the cartilage. And because there's so much growth and all this crazy activity occurring, what ends up happening is the cartilage is no longer able to live, and it starts to die in random pockets, which is actually going to result in big holes, i.e. the holes of trabeculae. So basically what happens is the outside forms compact bone and then kind of starves out the cartilage on the inside, which then forces it to get holes, which then those holes allow delivery of osteoblasts to the inside, and then that network honeycomb inside gets to form bone. So now we have spongy bone on the inside where the shaft is. Now, if you recall, the inside of long bones is not spongy bone. It is a hollow. So what actually happens is you made spongy bone, and then what's going to happen is osteoclasts are going to chow down on the middle spongy bone until you have a medullary cavity chewed out. So the inside is going to be chewed hollow. Now, that concludes basically diaphysis. Our diaphysis is now formed. We have that nice thick compact bone in the outside edge, and the inside has a medullary cavity, hollow space, for yellow marrow. Now we're going to undergo secondary ossification. So what's going to happen is at the ends of the bones, we're going to do a similar process. So we created kind of an outer hard shell, and now our inside started to pop and create holes and create that spongy bone. All right? And blood vessels are starting to penetrate. It's creeping into the spongy bone hollows into the inside of the epiphysis region, and it's going to help start hardening and creating bony tissue on the inside of the epiphyseal area. So that point now, the middle of our bone in the shaft region, our diaphysis region, is bone, is compact bone, and maybe a tiny spongy bone, but mainly compact bone. And our epiphyseal region, the ends of our bone, have mainly spongy bone with a little bit of compact bone. And all that's left is some cartilage. You have a cartilage region between our ends and the shaft. And we have, again, articular cartilage that's at the very end to help prevent friction on our bones. But the big thing is we have that little cartilage space between the ends of our bone and the shaft region. That's actually the area that's going to pretty much last for most of your adolescence. So this structure of your bone with the ends being formed and the middle being solid bone, and then between the ends and the middle of your bone, that cartilage, that pretty much is the way your bones are through your childhood until you're about in your mid-20s. At that point, what happens is that cartilage region is going to expand, but over time, that cartilage starts to disappear and turn into bone. By the time you're 25, that cartilage is completely gone, and you are no longer going to grow. It's just going to stay solid bone. So, this is kind of what it looks like. That cartilage is kind of right between the end of your bone and the middle region. And if someone dies, if you're a forensic biologist, if you're studying crimes, cartilage rots, bone does not. So if you find a skeleton where the long bone is broken into 3 pieces, you can tell immediately that this skeleton is from someone who was under 25, because that little cartilage area has not become bone yet, so it's not all one piece. This is just kind of an image. We have the middle region being formed first. Then when that's formed, we start to form the ends of our bone, and then eventually we'll be able to elongate our bone and eventually grow our bones even wider. So we create that template though, starting with the cartilage model first. All right, the second way bone is made, and this is less common, is that between the bones that are formed by the cartilage endochondral model, so most of our bones are formed that way, even flat bones, there's little spaces, hollow spaces that aren't fully bone and aren't even made by cartilage. So sometimes we have sections of our body, particularly in our skull, where we just patch over the empty spaces between the bones with a thick sheet of fibrous connective tissue. Seems like a flaw. You have weird gaps that are just like papered over with like soft tissue, but it's not really a flaw because it's really helpful. All these hollows or soft squishy spaces in our skull is really critical when we're a baby, and we call those fontanelles or soft spots. It kind of freaks me out to hold like babies sometimes because they have squishy parts of their brain that or of their skull that if you push really hard on it, you can squish their brain. That's a soft spot. All right? And the reason why they're there in the first place is, remember, bone's really hard bone is difficult to grow quickly. Cartilage and soft tissues are easy to grow really quickly, and then you can paper over them or convert them into bone. And that's what these fontanelles do. It provides a region for the skull of a baby to grow really quickly, because in the first year of life, the baby's brain is growing really rapidly. By the end of the first year, like 1 to 2, the baby's head is almost the size it's going to be at as an adult. It's pretty big, all right? But as a newborn, the head is incredibly small. So you need this soft tissue there to give opportunity for the skull to grow really quickly and then get replaced by bone. In addition to that, because human heads are pretty big relative to the pelvis of the mom, it's also really hard for the baby to leave the mom. So you need these soft spots to kind of squish the baby's skull into kind of a torpedo shape so it's able to move out of the mom easily to kind of give like a softer torpedo-ishness to the skull so it can get out of the mom. And then after the baby's born, their head kind of relaxes back into the normal shape. All right? But thanks to that nice soft tissue, we can then take that soft tissue and then, similarly to how the cartilage was remodeled in endochondral ossification, what we do is we firm up the edges and start developing that spongy bone on the inside of that soft tissue, and then over time you create that bone with the spongy inside and the harder compact outside. So key takeaways: compact bone contains dense rings of bony matrix laid out in concentric rings, and they're found on the edges of your bones for protection. Spongy bone is found on the inside of bones, and its honeycomb trabeculae is what allows for our bones to be lighter and also allows for spaces for marrow to sit inside. Most bones are initially developed using a template of cartilage, and in some cases soft tissues, and that soft tissue or cartilage is capable of growing and expanding easily. But once it's calcified, it's not really expanded easily, and you kind of have to remove bone or to get it to grow bigger. And you have to do osteoclast work, cleaning up work in order to get the bone to grow. Endochondral ossification converts cartilage structures into bones, especially when it comes to making the long bones. There's 2 stages. There's primary ossification, where you start with the shaft in the middle, and then there's secondary ossification, where you're forming the ends of the bone. And then the region between the middle and the ends of the bones, that is the epiphyseal plate, which allows for your bones to get longer up until the age of 25. For some of us, it'll be earlier. For some of you guys, it'll be later. I know some people who didn't get a growth spurt until like the beginning of college. It took a while for the epiphyseal plate to start kicking in. In general, ossification begins on the membranes surrounding the cartilage or tissue templates. So again, in general, the outer edges of your bone form first. And once that occurs, the cartilage on the inside hollows out, and it leaves space for blood vessels to grow and transfer osteoblasts inside. And then that it allows you to convert the inside into spongy bone. And there's an extra step involved in the diaphysis region, where that spongy bone is then hollowed out to create the medullary cavity. And that's where your osteoclasts work. And then finally, when it comes to bone development, there's patches where you have soft tissue, and that is going to be converted into bone also. But those are done through what's called intermembranous ossification, where you convert the soft tissues into flat bones in those random passages or pockets around your skeleton. In particular, though, it's mainly the fontanelles in your skull where it's done. And those fontanelles are important for the early life of a child, but then you don't want those soft spots to remain as the kid gets older, because you don't want those vulnerabilities to last a lifetime. You want to get rid of those vulnerabilities once they're no longer an advantage. All right, that concludes our notes. Move on to any other work you have for the day. Bye.